The philosophy of anti-natalism has had a significant resurgence over the last few years, with many YouTube channels and social media influencers promoting the following view: that having children is inherently immoral. This is the central claim of anti-natalism, that bringing new lives into this world is morally wrong, and there are plenty of arguments that are in support of this view. Far from being just a new phenomenon, anti-natalism actually has its roots in ancient Greece. It's a philosophy that's thousands of years old, with many advocates throughout history. But the most famous philosopher, at least in the analytic tradition, in favor of anti-natalism is David Benatar, and he is the one that formulated most of the arguments that we see today. After reading a lot about anti-natalism, I decided to write a paper about it, and I intend to publish this paper in the near future. In the paper, I am trying to refute every single core argument for anti-natalism by dividing them into two main categories: the philanthropic arguments and the misanthropic arguments. In this video, I am going to take the contents of this paper that I am writing and present it to you in simplified version in order to debunk anti-natalism in as short a period as possible. To begin, I am going to attack the philanthropic arguments as they seem to be the most popular in this day and age. The first philanthropic argument is the argument from consent. To put it simply, the argument says the following. Premise 1. In order for a decision to be moral, every person affected by that decision must consent to it. Premise 2. Individuals cannot give consent to be born, since they do not exist before their birth. Conclusion: therefore, the decision to bring a person into existence violates their consent, and hence it is immoral. Intuitively, this argument may sound good, but if we examine it closer, it becomes very obvious that it is based on a false assumption. It is based on the assumption that people who do not yet exist have the right to consent. Because otherwise, if we showcase that people who do not exist don't have the right to consent, then we obviously prove that we cannot violate their consent, since they don't have it. So here is a simplified version of my counter-argument to the argument from consent. Premise 1. The right to consent is a moral property of persons, and it applies to them due to their ontology, which is such that they are living beings with consciousness, personal inclinations, memories, and direct impact on the lives of others. Premise 2. Non-existent persons lack all of those characteristics, because the only property of non-existent beings is their lack of properties. Conclusion: non-existent persons do not have the right to consent. To put it very simply, what I am saying is that people who do not exist are not people. You cannot say that a non-existent person has the qualities of an existent person, because non-existent things are equal and the same. All non-existent things are simply non-existent. They do not have any distinction between themselves. To say that a non-existent person has the right to consent is the same as saying that a non-existent chair has the right to consent, because non-existent things only have one common quality, which is that they do not exist. Therefore, the argument from consent is from the very start completely absurd and obviously illogical. The only real answer that the anti-natalist can use in this situation is that even though non-existent persons do not have ontological qualities right now, they may have in the future, and therefore their possible existence should be taken into account. And to this, I simply reply with a distinction between what actually has possible existence and what doesn't. Because you see, in order for something to have possible existence, it must be at least in the process of becoming. It must have some sort of probability of existing. But if you actually don't want to procreate, if you decide that you are not going to procreate, if you have already made that decision, then there is absolutely zero possibility for an existent person. This non-existent person now has zero possibility of ever existing, and therefore doesn't even have possible existence. In order for something to have possible existence, and therefore possible value, it must at least have some probability of becoming real. Therefore, the decision about whether to procreate or not is not a decision about a possible person, but only a decision about whether a completely non-existent person should have possible existence in the first place. And so to say that to not procreate is the correct action for a possible person is again absurd, because we're not referring to the same ontological entity. The moment you decide to not procreate, you stop dealing with a possible person and you start dealing with a completely non-existent entity. Now, the second argument in favor of anti-natalism is the asymmetry of pleasure and pain argument. This argument essentially gives us an analysis about pleasure and suffering, which state that the presence of pain is bad, the absence of pain is good, the presence of pleasure is good, but the absence of pleasure is simply not bad. And in this sense, there is an asymmetry between pleasure and pain in the human experience. By giving this analysis, Benatar and many contemporary philosophers propose that it is inherently immoral to bring a person into existence, since this asymmetry exists. According to the argument, non-existence is superior to existence because it lacks pain, which is good, and also lacks pleasure, which is simply not bad. Whereas existence has pleasure, which is good, but also has pain, which is bad. And obviously, to force a person to have bad experiences due to the presence of pain is completely immoral, even though we are also giving them something good. And I'm not even going to try to rebut this analysis of pleasure and pain, because it is obviously true. What I am going to attack is the premises of this argument, and more specifically, a hidden premise that it does not state. This hidden premise is that the worthiness or unworthiness of a life is determined merely by some symmetry or asymmetry between pleasure and pain. And this is obviously a terrible use of reductionism, because we all understand inherently that the worthiness or unworthiness of life is not actually determined by pleasure and pain, but by purposefulness or lack of purposefulness. And the reason we understand that is because if you go and ask people whether they are happy or not, many of them will say that they're not happy. But if you tell them whether life is worth living or not, the vast majority will say that life actually is worth living. We understand inherently that there is a big difference between having a life worth living and having a life that has sufficient pleasure. Even if we generalize pleasure and say meaningfulness, we may say that, well, there is some meaningfulness to life or some pleasure to life, but according to the anti-natalist, this is not enough. Well, let me ask you something, Mr. Anti-natalist. Who gets to decide how much pleasure or how much value is enough to make a life worth living? The answer is obviously the subject. The answer is the person who actually gets to live that life. So to say that, as Benatar would say, people are delusional, there is something called the Delusional Gladness argument, that they're delusional about their evaluation of life's worth. To say that is merely to presume that the philosopher has some perfect image of how much value is enough to go on living. But obviously this is not an objective measure, this is a subjective matter. I may see a beautiful rose and say, you know what, this is enough for me to go on living today because I simply like roses. The anti-natalist cannot say anything to me about that. It's not that I am delusional, it's simply that I value things differently than the anti-natalist. The question of worthiness is not a question about pleasure and pain, but about purposefulness and value, and these are decided subjectively. There may be objective measures of value, sure, but how much of it is enough is a subjective matter, and therefore the whole argument from the asymmetry of pleasure and pain falls short. Because we know that the majority of people do in fact find enough purpose to go on living from day to day. And that was a debunking of anti-natalism in under 10 minutes.